When we think of cognitive psychology, we tend to think of a man named Donders as the first actual cognitive psychologist, because he took those reaction time problems and turned it into a study of thinking. What he did was first he studied the differences in reaction time between people, and then he added a thinking component. So when you have the baseline, the average and the standard deviation, I'm not sure they used standard deviation back then, but they had the average. What you do is you take your reaction time and then see how much longer it takes them to make a choice. For example, they would have, if the light is green, push the left button. If the light is red, push the right button. And that processing actually took longer than just the reaction speed. And the conclusion from this is that thinking is not instantaneous. It actually takes time, which back then was a big breakthrough because we didn't have anything that would measure the difference between cognitive psychology and just reaction. And if we don't have something to tell the difference, it's like we don't know that it's not instantaneous. For example, in the activity where you look into a mirror and you move your eyes, you can't actually see your eyes move. But if someone's watching you do this, they can see your eyes move. We can't perceive how much time it takes us to think because for us individually, it's instantaneous. The second man we think about with studying thinking is a man named Hermann Ebbinghaus. What he did was he wanted to study memory. And memory is another one of these invisible things. You can't study it because it's invisible, so you kind of have to study a behavior based on it. Like Donders did. Now with Ebbinghaus, what he did was he took nonsense three-letter syllables. Q-E-H, D-U-H, L-E-M, whatever. And he had to memorize a bunch of them. And then once he had them all memorized, he took track of how long it took him to forget these things. And he worked with himself first, and then when he got the idea and the principles down, he studied other people to get an average. What he found was most of our learning, we forget almost instantaneously. Like, for example, if you study for cram for a test, or even study for a test, as soon as you take that test, if the words in the material is not meaningful to you, what happens after that test? Well, you tend to forget most of it. That's why in psychology, anyway, when we want to teach you something, we try to make it meaningful. We ask you, well, how does this relate to you? What did you think when you were doing these? What did you think when you were reading this stuff? I want to make sure that you understand that in order for you to remember it long term, you have to make it personal. You have to tell a story with it that means something to you. Have you experienced it in real life? The next major figure in cognitive psychology is a man named William James. Now, up till this moment, structuralism had been the wave of the future. And it was now the wave of the past, because it was German. And William James was American. And he was wondering, well, you know, this studying in the lab is interesting, I suppose. Attention is fascinating. But really, how does this help people? How does studying how many frequencies the ear hears and how many colors the light sees, how does that help someone who's just been through a miscarriage or just lost their parents? It wasn't useful. And he wanted psychology to be pragmatic, was his word. Functionalism is the word they associated to him, but he liked pragmatic. He liked useful. And psychology, if it was ever going to take off, had to be useful to people. Now, if you've ever read anything from a cognitive psychologist, you'll notice one thing when they talk about the early 1900s, is they really dislike behaviorism, which is strange because the most common form of treatment now is called cognitive behaviorism, cognitive behavioral treatment, CBT, and it's a combination of cognitive and behavioral psychology. But they really don't like each other, and here's why. When behaviorism took off, behaviorism believes that the things inside the head are totally irrelevant. Only behavior interacts with the world. And if Freud's right, the unconscious is ruling the thinking anyway. So what does it matter what we're thinking when behavior, how you responded in the past, is going to be how you're likely to respond in the future because of rewards or punishments? Well, that is actually more effective than thinking about thinking. And Freudian's work was hardly effective at all. The Freudian therapy, psychodynamics, not very useful. Behaviorism, however, had a near 80% success rate. Cognitive psychology really hadn't taken off at all because, well, one, we couldn't measure it yet. There wasn't that technology. But also, thinking about thinking was invisible. There's no real practical application to something that's invisible at the time. And behaviorism was something you could actually see people do, see animals do. But according to a cognitive psychologist, we lost 40 years thinking about behaviorism and totally dismissing what was going on in the head. That may not be entirely accurate, but this is cognitive psychology, and you have to be aware that this is what cognitive psychologists actually believe. So, Cognitive psychologists do not like behaviorism because they believe behaviorism dismisses the mind, where cognitive psychologists believe the most important thing happens in the mind. The choice-making, the decision-making, the free will. Whereas in behaviorism, there's no such thing as free will because you're responding to other people. Then along comes a man named Noam Chomsky. And behaviorism is all the rage. Kids are being taught how to behave through behaviorism. And it's effective, but behaviorism doesn't really teach thinking or critical skills or even self-management. So Noam Chomsky comes along and says, well, wait a second, behaviorism can't be everything, because if we learned everything by behaviorism, it would take 14 to 15 years to learn the vocabulary that we learn by the time we're 5, if we had to be rewarded for every single word. And also, little kids say all kinds of things that they're never rewarded for, like, I hate you. Especially, I hate you, mommy. Who's going to reward a kid for that? So, kids have to, there must be something going on in the brain that's not just behavioral. And surprisingly, that one little chink in the armor pretty much broke down the entire behavioral structure. And people went back to thinking as being more important. It was an either-or concept back then, and these days it's, you know, some of this, some of that, and the psychologist who has the biggest toolbox is the one who's going to have the correct answer. But for a long time it was an either-or competition, and all they did was argue until they brought in statistics. What saved cognitive psychology was actually the invention of the computer, because all of a sudden we had a thinking machine that we could actually format our own paradigm, our own thinking system, our own framework around. So in a computer, you've got your processor, your math coprocessor. They had these back then. Your video processor. I got one of those. That's what's making this video so bright. But in the human mind, you've got short-term memory, long-term memory, encoding, retrieval. It's quite a flowchart that you can really only think of in terms of a flowchart. And we needed computer processing. It's called information processing. And that's how we framework this entire idea that the mind kind of works like a computer. Now, if you say the mind is exactly like a computer, no, that's not appropriate at all, because a computer tends to work serially. At least they do for now. In the future, who knows what they're going to do. But for now, it has to go through every piece of memory and find out what it's looking for. Whereas the human brain is more of a network and has a lot of shortcuts. In fact, the only major benefit, the only major advantage the brain has over a computer in this day and age is that we take a lot of shortcuts. Now, those shortcuts tend to lead to errors, like heuristics and generalization and stereotypes, but we do make a lot of shortcuts, and that helps us keep up with the fact that people, when we were evolving, were trying to kill us all the time, and we had to stay ahead of other people. Animals weren't really such a big deal. Yes, there was a bear every once in a while, but for the most part, you were hiding your food, hiding your resources, hiding your people from other people, so they wouldn't come and kill them and take them, and kill you and take them. Essentially, our brain is keeping us alive. There's a lot of unconscious processes keeping us alive, but we have to conceptualize it as a computer in order to get the idea of the framework. And the framework tends to be very useful because the idea of a theory in psychology that's useful is one that we can predict and use to make further theories. So as technology advances, right now we're rather limited by the technology we have. Once we get more brain imaging capability, where we can see real-time brain issues as they occur, then we'll be able to, you have to be careful what you call abnormal or distressing, because just because someone has a problem, that doesn't necessarily mean it's an actual problem. But with technology and brain imaging in the future, we should be able to make a lot of advances just as soon as the brain imaging and holographics, that would be fun, material arises.